Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tech Talks with Shreya the Cray. My name is Shreya, and I will be your host for the day. We are starting off our serverless March month with an amazing mentor, developer advocate, and Microsoft MVP, Marc Duiker. Hi, Marc. How are you doing today?
Hey, yeah, I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Do you want to give us a little introduction about who you are?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Mark. Indeed, as Shreya mentioned, Microsoft MVP for the last couple of years, and that's mostly because of my contributions I do for the serverless part of Azure. You might have heard about Azure Functions University, where myself and a whole group of people create content to learn about Azure Functions. Currently, I'm a senior developer advocate at Ably, where we enable developers to create real-time experiences, which is a lot of fun. Especially this week is a lot of fun because we were doing innovation days to trying to create and come up with new ideas how we can use Ably
That's
for
awesome.
nice new developer experiences. So it's been great.
That's awesome. Could you tell us a little bit more about Innovation Days? I'm actually really curious about it.
Yeah, so this is the first time that they were doing it. So it's 3 days. First, you need to assemble your team, and the idea is that you don't work with the people who you already work with regularly. So try to pick and choose your teammates a bit more carefully and to enable some other interactions. And then, of course, you have to decide on a topic, and my idea on the topic was to create an extension for VS Code that you can manage your Ably app straight from within VS Code. My team was now working on it for 2 days, and it's going really quite well. It was the first time that I'm creating a VS Code extension from scratch. I've been working on VS Code pets, but that was more like adding some pixel art and some bit of code to make it work. But the developer experience for creating extensions is quite okay. Most of things are quite well documented, not everything, but it's going quite well. Yeah, so tomorrow is the final day. We're going to make a presentation, and hopefully we will win the best idea of Ably.
I hope so. I mean, I'm voting for you, so you better win. Let's just jump into it. Before we get started with like the whole what is serverless concept, could you give us a little bit of background of your experience with serverless?
Right. So my interaction with serverless started when I started to work for my previous company I worked for. They gave me an assessment for, okay, please implement this business functionality, and you can pick and choose anything you want. Just go for it. And then Azure Functions was just announced, so the serverless compute from Azure. So I thought, oh yeah, this is a nice shiny new thing. I'm going to see how that works, and I'm going to make this assessment using Azure Functions. But that failed actually quite miserably because it was still very much preview, and it wasn't that well documented. So after a couple of days in the assessment, I thought, oh no, this is not going to work well. So I actually stopped working on the serverless solution and went back to a bit of a more standard traditional API. Luckily the assessment went well afterwards, and I got that job. But that was my first interaction with anything serverless. So it was not the best experience. But that it still triggered me enough. And okay, I still want to see this work, and I want to know how everything fits together. So it did intrigue me a lot. So then I just continued to focus on it, and I'm glad I did.
That's amazing. I love how like every good story starts with some amount of failure, and then you're just kind of like working your way up to improving on it. Very real and relatable story. Let's just dive into it. What is serverless? Like, if you had to explain that to someone who's never heard about it before, how would you describe it?
Yeah, exactly. The term I always use is worry about servers less. So that's is, I think, quite a
That's fair.
description. You still need to know, okay, what are servers then?
Mhm.
But in the let's say in the old days, you had these either hardware servers or virtualized servers where you had to install all kinds of tools on and do lots of configuration, and it took you days and days before you could even add some code and some business functionality. And with serverless, all of that management around the infrastructure is not up to you anymore. That's handled by the cloud provider. So you can actually focus on delivering business value. So you can focus on writing some code, pushing it to the serverless compute that you're using, and hopefully that's it.
Got it. That's a great explanation. Serverless makes sense. Now, if I were to do like a quick deep dive into serverless on Google, there's a lot of terminology that comes up and a lot of things that seem to encompass in serverless. So I see things like functions, architecture, scalability. Like there's just a lot. Could you kind of clarify what we're talking about when we say serverless and what we're not talking about in that topic?
Yeah, exactly. And also the definitions I use is just one of the many definitions out there. So I think one of the most important parts are the payment model. So when most people talk about serverless, they mean you just pay for usage. So the pay-as-you-go model. As long as there are people going to your website and clicking on buttons and let's say ordering stuff through your website, then all these serverless functions are running and then you pay for it. But as soon as no one is on your website, all the functions are not running and they're not even spinned up in the cloud anymore. So then you're also not paying anything. So I think the pay-as-you-go one is probably one of the biggest definitions of serverless. Another big thing has to do with scalability, as you already mentioned. One of the major things is that people consider serverless if it can completely scale down to zero. Because if it completely scales down to zero, it also means that you're not paying for it. So it's also, again, it's also cost related again. So those are the two biggest things. But it's definitely more than only compute. So it's more than only functions. So most people think it's only about functions that can execute code. But it's also about storage, data storage. It's also serverless. You can pay only for the storage that you use, and usually it's combined with you pay for a query for reading some data, or you pay whenever you put some data in storage. So that's also pretty well defined.
Yeah, and then for our newer audiences, could you also explain what you mean by the cloud, and what does that entail?
Good point. Yes. So before, let's say the cloud, everybody has their own laptop, and that has some compute power, and that also has some storage. And if you want to go one step further, you can have a server, and that server can be still a physical server that maybe sits on your desk. But there are these data centers all over the world which have millions of servers for you. So you don't have to have your own server tucked away on your desk, but what you're actually doing is you rent some capacity from those data centers. And so if you use the cloud, it means you're actually using someone else's their computers, someone else's servers. And cloud providers have dozens and dozens of different services running on those servers in those data centers. So with those services, it makes it very, let's say, relatively easy for you to add real business value, because you don't have to write a lot of code yourself. You can, let's say, mix and match all of the components that the cloud provider gives you.
Now, what we're talking about seems to be like a very powerful tool. Is it something that you think would work for any area of tech, any type of developer, or do you think that there's like certain types of developers that this is more useful for and brings more value to?
Well, I see serverless used in lots of verticals. I've seen it used in the financial industry, in e-commerce, in communication services. So serverless seems to be everywhere these days. But I think the thing it handles best is when there's a lot of, let's say, small events involved. And so I already mentioned the e-commerce sample. So if you have a website and you sell books and lots of people are on your website, then you have lots of small transactions on that website, and serverless is really ideal for that. Also because during the day, probably a lot of people are on your website, but during the night, probably no one is there. So that means that the workload changes significantly during the day. And that's also ideal because serverless will scale out for you and also scale in for you. You don't have to worry about that. When you need that flexibility in scaling, then serverless is ideal for you.
Yeah, that's really helpful because I feel like a lot of newer developers, newer engineers might kind of struggle with this idea of, is this a path that I want to go down? Do you recommend serverless for new developers? Are there any skills that you think are valuable to have before you try to like dive into that field?
Yes, well, I did a lot of consultancy over the years, and for all of my clients, I always recommend them please pick the highest level of abstraction that a cloud provider can offer you, and serverless is really one of the highest abstractions that is offered, because it requires the least management of cloud infrastructure. But it does have so the positive thing is you don't have to care about your infrastructure management and maintenance, but the downside is you also have very little control over it. So you don't get to control of how big is the machine that your code is running on, and things like that. So if you don't need that control, then please stay in the highest level of abstraction as possible, so serverless. If you do need more control, either you need it for more, maybe more security requirements, or you have really specific needs for very large storage, or very large memory, or compute power, CPU power, then you have to probably pick another service, because service is only offering what's there. You don't have full control over that.
Definitely. I do want to get deeper into like the versatility side of serverless in a minute. But you mentioned a little bit about the history of serverless at a surface level, about how like before you just had your computer and you had to do everything on that said computer. And if you needed more space, more computing ability, you would have to just get another computer and manage servers entirely on your own. So what was the tech world like before that, especially for companies? Because if you're just building a software project by yourself, it's a little simpler. But if you're out here trying to build like the next Google or something like that without serverless, what would that have looked like?
Yes, well, there were definitely a lot of more people involved and necessary, right? So I've been doing a lot of software development over the years, but I definitely do not have, let's say, big networking skills or maintenance skills when it comes to server administration or stuff like that. So when people were still developing on or using either hardware data centers on-premise, or maybe some other data centers, but not really cloud stuff yet, then you really need to have the knowledge and skills in-house for people to administer and maintain that. And that's really, that's a real dedicated role. It's not something that most developers do. And so these days, DevOps is really popular. So you do a bit of both. So you do development, but you also do, let's say, a bit of maintenance. And I think these days that works because there's not so much maintenance that you need to do. But when you have to still apply lots of security patches to your operating system and to keep it up to date for security wise, and do all kinds of installations to your servers, that also takes a lot of time, but that's a lot of time that you can't focus on really adding business value. And then you're just making sure that things keep on running. Those two skills are really quite different. So, and I think those skills are definitely still in demand, but that's more than now done at the data center level. So people who work at Microsoft or AWS are now doing these things instead of the developers or the DBAs at clients.
So there are still people doing it, but it's more of as an app developer who's not working in AWS, who's not working in Azure, you can just focus on getting right into building a really powerful tool. You can use your engineers and your entire team to focus on things that are more important to you and not have to worry about like the server end of things for yourself. Awesome. And then how have you seen serverless grow over time? Is it exactly the same that it was 10 years ago, or is it like constantly changing?
No, it definitely changed. Yes. So the serverless compute is also not one of the first ones. I think the first serverless service that was offered was, I think, a blob storage for when we talk about Azure. Because there was also a pay-as-you-go model. So you pay for a bit of storage you have. Blob storage is for files and other binaries. And you pay whenever you put something in there, and you pay when you read something from storage. So that was a real serverless solution. And I think that was... I think Azure is from 2007, 2008, and also blob storage was also one of the first services there. So I think serverless is from around 2008 when it comes to Azure. And functions, Azure Functions, so the compute, service compute, what's available, that only got there in 2016. So 8 years later. So that's quite a big step. There are other services which are not completely serverless, but also not really, let's say, full maintenance. And there are these app services, but then you usually still pay per month instead of pay as you go. But if you look at Azure Functions specific, so that started in 2015, 2016, but that has also grown in the last couple of years. And so it started with the consumption model. So that's really pay as you go, and you don't have any control over the size of the machine or how many CPU is used and things like that. But now these days they also have a premium tier. So now you do have a bit of control over, okay, I want to use a bigger machine for this workload with more CPU or more memory. So there are more services. And also when you look at storage, so there's now also serverless SQL and serverless Console DB. So there are more newer services, but also within these services, things keep improving and additional tiers are there and new features are added. So that's still very much growing.
If serverless was something that started like 20, 30 years ago, it would be a different story. But because it started so recently, and you're mentioning like 2008, 2016 types years, there's probably a lot of developers out there. In fact, there are a lot of developers out there that are so used to developing from before serverless times, right? So what has that experience, like how is that experience different for someone like me who like just started coding versus someone who was coding way before serverless was a thing? Like what is that experience like?
Yes, well, yeah, I have so mostly I can share my own experience, which is indeed I'm quite used to developing indeed in the time before serverless, but I definitely see a big difference there. So if you're completely new to programming in general, then you're probably quite easily used to this serverless model, and you think, okay, that's the default way I'm doing these things now. But when I started to learn it, then it was really something different. So I wasn't used to that services or servers were just being up for a couple of minutes, but then would spin down again. That means you have to rethink how you're doing your architecture of your application. And you have to think in smaller, shorter life cycles, and you have to think more also in a bit of a more microservices way. So instead of one big web server that has all functionalities, you think more in smaller either microservices or function apps that have a very dedicated functionality. So it really requires a bit of a rethinking of creating applications and doing some systems architecture. So I think it can be beneficial if you're completely new to the field, because then it's normal. But otherwise it really takes some time. So it becomes your new normal.
That's right. It becomes your new normal. And you also mentioned that like way earlier in the video, you mentioned that you kind of struggled with serverless in the beginning. What was the point at which you decided, instead of saying no to it because it's just not working out for you, you're actually going to pursue it as like a very distinctive part of your career?
Good point. Yes. Well, I was really intrigued by the idea. Not paying a fixed amount per month for something, but just paying whenever you need it and when it's actually used. I think that idea is great. And so it can actually save you money. It will also save you resources. These things are also better for the environment because when they're not used, they completely spin down. So I think there are a lot of benefits that are in favor of using serverless. Both from an environmental standpoint, but also a financial standpoint. Because I was so intrigued by the potential it had, I was committed to spend a bit more time on it and to investigate more in how things were working. But also, sharing knowledge about it, because especially in the beginning, it was lacking some documentation and there was very little information available about it, which is normal when something is new. But I definitely wanted to make it easier for other developers to enjoy Azure Functions as well. So that's why I decided to make some more material around it to make it easier for other people to use.
I love that. I love that you're taking like all of your own personal struggles and using your experience to help future developers not have to face those. Because it clearly seems like a technology that like most, if not all developers will have to at least like in some way interface with in their careers. Um, and then you specifically work mostly with Azure, right? So how would a developer make the decision about whether they would go down the Azure route or AWS or GCP or another provider?
Yes, yeah. To be honest, I think those occasions will be very rare to make that decision, because I think that the chance is pretty big that you'll end up with a company that has already taken a direction in a certain cloud provider, or you might up ending in a team that already has knowledge of a certain technology stack that fits very well within those cloud providers. So then you're probably not in a situation to choose it. I think that the only reasons where you really would make a choice if you join like a super new startup that hasn't made any decisions yet on which platform to use, or quite the opposite, you join an organization that is still doing stuff on premise, and you help them to go into the cloud. So yeah, those are the only two situations I can think of where you have to help in the decision or make the decision itself.
That's fair. Yeah. Um, could you maybe give us some examples on types of projects where like like serverless would be valuable versus some that there wouldn't? Because I know you mentioned that it's like a pay as you go subscription, and there's like this whole idea of if you want more control, maybe it's not right for you. So what kind of examples would work for that?
Yes. Well, one of the examples has to do with the workload, or how much flexibility and scaling you need. So if for instance you are indeed helping a company that's doing completely no cloud solutions at all, but you help them to go make use of the cloud for the very first time, well, then you can look at what is their current workload that is still running on their on-premise data servers. And if that workload is very constant all the time, so day in, day out, during day and during night, if it doesn't vary that much, well, then initially that doesn't really sound like serverless would be beneficial, right? Because one of the benefits of serverless is that it can very easily scale out and scale back in. But since you don't have a workload that requires scaling, then why would you bother with serverless? So that would be one of the reasons. Another reason is if you have really very strict requirements around network security and things like that, you can get that also in a serverless model, but then you have to go one of the higher tiers, which are then also a bit more expensive. So then you can ask yourself, okay, I can make it work with serverless, but it's not that natural because you still are doing then a bit more of the infrastructure configuration and management. Then you could choose let's say an app service instead, where you just pay a fixed amount fixed amount of money per month, and have some other things out of the box for you. So you have some more knobs to tweak when it comes to security.
That's fair. And then do you like happen to know off the top of your head any like actual applications or companies that are fully serverless versus ones that are entirely not serverless and probably aren't going to be in the future?
Okay. I think a lot of these food delivery companies are doing it serverless. And also, I don't think I can mention them all by name. But
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
But I think all of them are doing serverless these days, because they do require that scalability. Because at certain moments during the day, they get a lot of orders in. But once lunchtime or dinner is over, then all of the requests drop significantly. So they really have that scalability requirement. For myself, I worked for a lot of financial organizations, and although you might think, okay, those maybe are, let's say, use older technology, well, partly that's true, but they're also quite modernizing very quickly and all going to the cloud. So they're also actually very open to use new technology. So I was involved with lots of projects, mostly, let's say, some backend services for like intranet functionalities, and we were actually changing some codes or removing parts of code in let's say the bigger web servers they had running and moving it over to smaller function apps, because one of the examples was, for instance, reporting. We need to add different reporting functionalities to the intranet, and the reporting functionality is not always needed. It's more like an on-demand thing. So when a request for a report comes in, then you need to run it. So I think that was a good use case to use serverless for, because it's not a constant workload. It's just very spiky. So sometimes you have these requests for reports, and then a couple of hours you have nothing again.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. And then if we're talking about more of like an in-between product, right? Like your product was built before serverless times, or you just didn't use serverless when you first started building it, and now you're transitioning into it over time and integrating it. How does that developer experience look like?
It does help if you have a bit of knowledge of both worlds then, because you need to remove a certain functionality in your old application, and you need to rebuild that functionality in a new situation. So what I find very useful is using queues to decouple functionalities. We built a piece of new functionality in a function app, and that function app is then triggered by a message that we can put on a queue. And once the new function app is in place and is deployed, then we make sure that the original application can place a message on that queue. So instead of handling that functionality itself, that first application, the old application, just puts the message on the queue, and that makes sure that the new function app is then triggered and does the processing. So yeah, you need a way of decoupling, and usually using queues is one of the best ways to do that.
I think overall, in terms of understanding serverless, we've gotten a pretty good foundational understanding of it. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on the future of serverless and how it's going to grow over time.
Yes, well, I think there definitely will be more, let's say, existing services that will move into the serverless area. So we've seen it with a lot of different storage services. So for instance, there was like Azure SQL for a long time, which you have to pay a fixed amount of money per month. But then there was like also SQL serverless, and the same for Cosmos DB. So there'll probably be more of these situations where they take an existing service and then they serverless that service. But I can also imagine the existing Azure functions will be fine-tuned more, so that maybe becomes even easier to use. So maybe the abstraction level will be pulled even higher, and which means that you also lose a bit of control. So I expect that maybe there will add a few more tiers, because you have the serverless consumption model, which the pay-as-you-go, where you have very little control, and then you have the premium model, where you have some more control. So I can definitely see that they maybe add some more tiers where you have a bit of a slider between having a very high abstraction but no control versus a bit less abstraction but more control.
Definitely. And we're going to be having a longer discussion on this next week with Jonah Anderson, but I'm curious, like, as a Microsoft MVP, obviously you have engaged a lot with the serverless community. How do you think that community is going to grow over time?
Right. Yeah. Well, there's already quite a shortage of developers, and I can definitely see more usage of serverless in the next coming years. And because even though it's being used quite significantly already, the majority of the companies is not there yet. But they will probably want to move in the direction, right? Because it will probably have some cost savings for them. So they probably want to go that way. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for the serverless community to share knowledge and to educate new developers, and definitely also to keep the community open for new developers and keep the community healthy. So yeah, I think the community will play a very big role in keeping it sustainable and to stay learning, to keep learning.
Awesome. I mean, I'm completely dependent on the community, so I really do hope that it grows quickly. I'm one of the newer developers, so right now I'm just like learning from everyone else, and then in the future, hopefully, I'll also be someone like you educating other developers on more serverless things. But thank you so much, Marc. It was really nice to get a chance to sit down and talk to you and kind of pick your brain about all things serverless. Did you have any last thoughts?
Well, specifically when it comes to learning, I mean, and learning on yourself, if you can do that's fine. But I think it even works better if you find a buddy so you can learn stuff together and share your experiences together. So if you're in a position where you start to learn something new, find someone else who is in the same situation.
Awesome. And if you want more information, I should have mentioned this earlier, but Marc has a whole series of YouTube videos. Marc, do you want to just like quickly introduce that?
Oh, yes. So it's a thing called Azure Functions University. We are on YouTube. It's called Serverless on Azure, the channel. Lots of introductory videos on how to use Azure Functions in all different languages. So we got C Sharp, TypeScript, Python, PowerShell. And next to the videos, we also have a GitHub repository, and that contains all kinds of lessons in Markdown format and also worked out sample code. So yeah, it's quite a lot of information that you can use to help to learn Azure Functions.
Yeah. So if you're interested in anything that Marc and I discussed today, go over to Azure Functions University, check it out, and you can learn more, get a full, proper deep dive there. And then next week, we're going to be here with Jonah Anderson, and we're going to talk a little bit about her experience with the serverless community. Thank you so much, Marc, for joining today.
Thanks.
Awesome.